Okay, so let's talk about the American Revolution. But maybe not the one you're thinking of, the one from your history textbook. Today, we're going to dive into a totally different take on America's founding story, using Howard Zinn's classic book, A People's History of the United States. Specifically, we're unpacking his chapter, A Kind of Revolution. This quote right here, this pretty much sums up the story most of us grew up with. You've got the heroic founding fathers, wise, brilliant, humane, and they create this perfect system for democracy and freedom. And look, it's a really powerful and inspiring story, but it might not be the whole story. And that's where Howard Zinn comes in. He basically asks us to hit pause on that heroic story and look at things from a different angle. What happens if we stop focusing on the famous leaders and instead see the revolution through the eyes of the ordinary people? Well, a much messier, more complicated picture starts to take shape. And that brings us to the title of Zinn's chapter, which is so deliberate, A Kind of Revolution. See that phrasing? He's not saying it wasn't a revolution, but he's suggesting it wasn't a revolution for everybody. So let's get into what exactly he means by that. Here's the absolute core of Zinn's argument. He says the colonial elite, the founding fathers, were in a tricky spot. They had all this anger from the lower classes about inequality. So they found a genius way to redirect all that anger away from themselves and point it straight at Great Britain. This move allowed them to kick the British out and take over, while also keeping the poor from rebelling against them. So to build this case, Zinn starts by asking a really basic question. Who was actually involved in this war? Was it really a united struggle of the people? Or were there some serious class divides right from the get-go? We have this image in our heads that everyone was waving flags and was passionately on board with the war. But Zinn points out that's just not the case. He actually uses John Adams' own estimate, which split the colonies into thirds. A third for the revolution, a third against it, and a whole third who were just neutral. That's hardly a nation rising up as one. And this is where that class divide really comes into focus. On one side, you have the leaders. We're talking about men like George Washington, literally one of the richest men in America. And on the other side, you have the guys who actually did the fighting. Poor mechanics, laborers, and small farmers who made up the bulk of the army. Zinn really drives this point home with a quote from another historian, John Shai. The people who had the least to gain from this war were the ones doing most of the fighting and, well, most of the dying. And like Shai says, it's a very old story. The wealthy lead and the poor bleed. Okay, so if the war was fought by the poor but led by the rich, Zinn's next question is pretty obvious, right? Who actually got all the good stuff when the fighting was over? Zinn lays out this incredibly clever strategy for how the new elite held on to power. Step 1, they took all this land from the loyalists who fled. Step 2, they kept the best chunks for themselves and their rich friends. But then, and this is the genius part, they gave out smaller pieces of land to some of the soldiers and small farmers. What did that do? It created a loyal middle class that would act as a buffer, as Zinn calls it, between the super wealthy at the top and the really poor at the bottom. And this quote from historian Carl Diegler just nails it. This wasn't a revolution where the poor overthrew the rich and a new class took over. Nope, it was more like a sideways trade. Power didn't move up from the bottom. It just moved from one group of elites, the British, over to a new group of American elites. So now we get to the final piece of Zinn's argument. You have this new power structure. How do you lock it in for good? And maybe more importantly, if you're building a national consensus, who gets left out of the club? And the answer, according to Zinn, is, well, almost everyone else. That famous phrase, we the people, turns out to have been pretty exclusive. It absolutely did not apply to enslaved black people. It didn't apply to Native Americans, whose land was now basically up for grabs. It didn't apply to women, who had no political rights. And it didn't even apply to white men if they didn't own property. The new America was for a very specific and very small group of people. And this is where the Constitution comes into play. In Zinn's view, this document was the final step, the thing that cemented this whole new system. It created a powerful central government that was specifically designed to protect the economic interests of this new ruling class. The big landowners, the rich merchants, the slaveholders, and to put down any future rebellions from all those people who had been left out. So at the end of the day, Zinn's entire way of looking at history really boils down to this one simple but incredibly powerful question. When we look at any event in history, what happens if we stop focusing just on the big, beautiful ideals and instead ask, who benefits? It's a question that just reframes everything, and it leaves you with a very, very different story of America.